All right, today's lecture is on the progressive movement, and this lecture is meant to supplement the reading, the homework, the classwork from your texts, from class activities. So this is the big picture, the overview, and hopefully you'll get more details in various activities that we take part in class. So the two important points that I want you all to know is, one, the progressive movement is exactly that. It's a movement trying to to create progress in American society. And there was all sorts of problems going on in American life, and these people that kind of fall under this title of progressive movement are trying to deal with these problems. And one of the big ideas of the progressive movement is the rise of the federal government in a way that regulate and monitors society. So the progressive movement rejects laissez-faire and actually looks upon government to play a role in regulating and improving society. Now, if you recall, over the last couple of weeks, couple months, we've been dealing with the industrial age, and there were so many different positive things that came out of this period of time. But there were also some difficult things that were not being addressed by politicians, the government, whether it be at the federal or the state level. And one of the big things was the rise of cities. Showing this the city, y'all, the city, the city, y'all, come on. You have rapid urbanization going on during this time period. In fact, this urbanization is pretty remarkable when you look at American history as a whole. So if you take a look at right here, by 1860, 80% of the American people lived in rural areas, agricultural, farmers, this type of thing. By 1900, that number quickly goes down to 60%. And you have 40% of people living in urban areas. By 1920, you have over half the American people living in an urban area. And if you go up here, you'll actually see that cities like New York more than double in just 30 years. Cities like Chicago go through a huge growth. And you go down and you see that this growth is tremendous. And cities, urbanization is not necessarily a problem, but what is a problem is, where do you put all these people? Where do you put them all? And many of the people, the working poor, the immigrant class, ended up living in slums. Slum beautiful. So amazing. Yeah. Ooh, they don't know. Okay, so slums are really poor housing conditions that people found themselves in. The most famous example is the dumbbell tenement, named after the weight, the dumbbell. And these slums were crowded. Disease was common. And this was a reality for so many people in American society, especially in cities like New York, Chicago. And you have these slums and the cities, the sewage and the waste, the trash, the water, all these services that we kind of think about and really we don't think about, they're not adequate to deal with this level of population. So you have scenes like this being relatively common. You have trash unable to be picked up. So basic services in these new urban areas are missing. Another problem that was kind of going on for quite a while was monopolies. Businesses coming together. Come together right now over me. This corporate consolidation, this coming together of businesses was a major problem. And, you know, Rockefeller, Carnegie, JP Morgan, these individuals, you know, enormously successful at business, but some of their business practices were causing concerns for the average American. This political cartoon is quite famous. You have Rockefeller literally with business and the government in the palm of his hands. The capital has been turned into an oil refinery, and you have this kind of, you know, major corporate consolidation, these monopolies, these trusts, able to fix prices to whatever they want. Workers were doing better during this time, but the problem was, even though there was an increase in real wages, we learned about how the workers, you know, people were coming over and work was changing. But the problem was, you still had trouble supporting a family. And child labor was becoming, unfortunately, extremely common. And kids working was the norm. In fact, it was also very normal to see injuries, long hours. and very difficult conditions for the nation's workers. There's different numbers depending upon what book you look at, but by some estimates, 10 hours a day was average. 12 hours was not uncommon either. So you have these very difficult conditions, and if you remember in the last unit, we took a look at how workers were trying to deal with these problems, and we saw that there were all sorts of strikes taking place, and workers, unfortunately, were suffering defeat after defeat. We had the Haymarket riot, we had the Pullman strike, the Great Railroad strike, which took place in a couple of different cities, and you also had the Homestead strike. Death, violence, oftentimes followed these events. Different groups organized. You can read about the International Lady Garment Workers to show you, kind of remind you just, how bad things were. There was the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where in 1911 you had a group of women working in this factory. Fire erupts. As you can see in this image, just the fire spreads very quickly. The sewing equipment is still there, charred. The people working inside had very little options in terms of what to do or where to go. The fire trucks could not safely get to the 10th story, which is where the workers were. These women had been working for many of them 14 hours a day. The doors are locked, so they can't exit in the building. And what ends up happening is you have women jumping to their death, hitting the sidewalk, others burning to death. And this is a real wake-up call for a lot of Americans that, this system of lack of regulation wasn't working. And you have 146 people who lose their lives during this event. Enormous tragedy, but this is just one. This is the most famous one. It's the Triangle Shirtwaist. It's in New York. 146 women die. The media does cover this, but there were many examples, smaller instances of the Triangle Shirtwaist kind of experience. Here you got actually a political cartoon showing the greed of the employer keeping the women trapped inside the fiery building. People mourning the deaths of those women in the days and weeks that followed. And people starting to organize in different unions as well. You could see the Jewish influence of the immigrants, the United Hebrew Trades of New York. We have the Local 25, We Mourn Our Loss. Some Americans, and we still haven't even gotten to the progressive era, start turning to more radical reform efforts. There's this idea that somehow capitalism is failing. Workers are underpaid, overworked, children are in factories, the environment is being polluted, and you get some people joining more radical organizations. One of the most radical one was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. And they were represented by their leader, a guy by the name of William Big Bill Haywood. And they never really a big union. They only had about 30,000 people in their union across the country. But their whole idea was a union for all workers. One big union. Got the worker over there with his shirt off. Hello. And you have this kind of union that's much more radical. They're willing to take strikes when they feel it's necessary. They're organizing not just the skilled workers, but also the unskilled workers. And they are constantly harassed by the government and accused of violence. But they're an example, and they have the nickname the Wobblies. And you can look them up and get the background about why they were called that. Is it Wobblies or Wobblies? I'm not sure. But you also have some Americans who are talking about socialism, that perhaps ending capitalism is the best thing that could be done for this country. And people who believe in socialism basically believe that there should be public ownership of factories. There should be no private property. Now, there was a split within the socialists. Some people felt that it should be like a Marxist approach, where you should have a revolution. Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, if you learned about that in world history. But that there were other people who believed in democratic socialism. You should vote for socialism. You should get candidates who run under socialist principles, and they actually formed a political party, the Socialist Party of America, SPA, and they ran people, and one of the people that they ran was a guy you all should remember from the Pullman strike, Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs is going to run for president 5 times from 1900 to 1920 under the Socialist Party platform. In fact, he's going to run on occasion from prison. In 1912, he will almost receive 1 million votes, 6% of the total of the votes, which doesn't seem like a lot, but for a third party it is, and he's going to run. And there were various places in the United States that had socialist mayors, socialist political officials, because people were looking for some alternative to the way things were. Now, all of this is the background to kind of what this chapter is about, because most Americans didn't turn to socialism. Most Americans didn't turn to these more radical labor unions, but there was this movement of change.
We gotta make a change. It's time for us as a people to start making some changes. Let's change the way we eat, let's change the way we live, and let's change the way we treat each other. You see, the old way wasn't working, so it's on us to do what we gotta do to survive.
So the progressive movement was very much about this idea of changing American society. And like I said, it is a movement. It is not united. Progressives is the label we've kind of given to this period of American history. But there's a whole bunch of problems. Child labor, monopolies, political corruptions, overcrowding in the cities, tenements, the environment, women's suffrage, the right to vote. There's going to be a whole bunch of issues that are going to be addressed by the progressive movement. It's not just one thing, and they're not all working together. But one of the things that's important to understand about the progressive movement is this idea that the government can play a role. The government can play a role, and there's a rejection of laissez-faire, and that the government can regulate. The government can regulate society. The government can try to impose rules for things like the workplace or the dealing of business. And within this idea is this idea that society can be improved.
Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for.
So you have this idea that society can be improved, and the progressives are just this exactly what it is. It's a movement. In terms of what it was, I'm going to give you a couple things, and I want you to write them down. So one thing you need to realize is it doesn't come from the government. The progressive movement is coming from private groups. It's not coming from a political party. It's not like the Republicans come up with this or the Democrats come up with this. It is different individuals and private groups that are pressuring for reform. Another thing about the progressive movement is it's mainly in the cities. It's a reform movement dealing with urban issues, urban problems. So the farmers are going to have their own reform movement. It's called the Populist Party, Populist. But the progressives are reformers. They're not radicals. They don't want to destroy capitalism or have a revolution. They are reformers. So there is something unique about the progressive era. They're in the cities. They are reformers. They're not radicals. And their issues are very kind of diverse. You have a whole bunch of progressive thinkers, and there's all these books and thinkers of the time period. But one of the kind of things that you should know is at the heart of the progressive movement is this rejection that social Darwinism, laissez-faire is the way things are. That's it. Society is what it is. The strong survive and the weak die off, and people are poor because they're lazy, and the rich are rich because they're just super fabulous. No. There are rules that are being broken and they need to be fixed. There is advantages that certain groups of people have, and the progressives are looking at the world with kind of a new, fresh set of eyes. So you have this kind of reform movement around these new ideas, rejecting laissez-faire. And a big part of the progressive era is during this same period of time, this post-Civil War era, education is improving in society. 1870 to 1920, you can take a look, the illiteracy rate in this country is dropping. People are becoming more educated. And that partly is because there's a growth in public schools. In fact, if you take a look, public school enrollment goes from 7 million in 1870 to 23 million by 1920. And you have new ways of looking at education. One of the guys that is kind of known as the father of American education is this guy.
Hey, teacher, believe in kids alone.
John Dewey. And John Dewey was one of these guys that talked about schools and this idea that schools could be areas for reform, that people go, students go, and they learn things. They learn things about democratic society. He wrote a book, Democracy in Education. He wrote books called The School and Society, and this idea that schools can go and fix things and inspire change and have progress. So John Dewey's ideas influenced people, but the biggest part of this kind of progressive movement was finding a group of people who are going to deal with the problem. Now I want you to think, what is the first step when you have to deal with a problem? And you have all these kind of, leaders of the last couple of years, with their thinking faces or their creepy thumbs up. And what you get is the first thing kind of progressives were known for was you have to expose the problem to the American people. You have to let people know who don't know about child labor or working conditions or monopolies or political corruption or who maybe only know a little bit about it. You have to get that problem in their brain. You have to make them get angry. And that's what muckrakers did. Muckrakers were these individuals who found out the problems, investigated them, and exposed them. To the American people. They're novelists, they're journalists, they're sparking reform by exposing problems that most people didn't know enough about. And one of the things that allows them to do this, because they emphasize facts. It's not just, hey, I think this sucks and you guys should get mad. No, learning about it, researching it, and then giving the public the information behind the problem. And one of the things that helps this process is the fact that during this period of time, the late 19th century, early 20th century, is improvements in technology. Improvements in technology, such as in printing. More people can read because they're more educated than they were before. But improvements in printing and photography allow these individuals to reach a mass audience. You're able to reach a mass audience because it becomes cheaper to print, more people can read, and it becomes cheaper to use photographs. That term muckraker actually comes from Theodore Roosevelt. He nicknamed that term this kind of idea of they're digging through the muck with this muck rake and they're exposing these problems. And there's all sorts of examples that you'll learn about when you read your book. You got Ida Tarbell writing in McClure's magazine, The Story of Rockefeller. You have Lincoln Steffens writing The Shame of the Cities about the urban poverty. You have Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle and about the working conditions in Chicago and the meat industry. And you have Lewis Hine who's going to take photos of children. It's not creepy as it sounds. And we have people today that still kind of do these types of things. You have people that expose problems, whether it be Al Gore with his movie The Inconvenient Truth, or Morgan Spurlock who did Super Size Me to expose the problem of obesity in America, or the figure Michael Moore, people love him, hate him, about his various movies he's made about health insurance and 9/11 and gun violence, or even books where they're exposing the difficulty of surviving in America, making minimum wage. So all of these are examples of progressive era. That's the overview. Make sure on the exam you know you have a couple things: rejection of laissez-faire, dealing with urban problems. It's not a unified movement. It does not come from government. It comes from a variety of special interest groups, and they're going to have various levels of success and various levels of failure depending upon the movement. Lecture 1, done. Study, eat your vitamin C, and good luck.